So I came across this iceberg on Reddit the other day and I opened the comments and I saw this. I was like, whoa, LJ, they're talking about me. That's me. We got this iceberg here. It's going to be interesting. And firstly, I want to state that this is strictly for educational purposes. And this should just be seen as a brief history of Al Qaeda as a terrorist organization, along with its affiliated groups and members. All right, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So we're going to be starting off in tier one, and the first thing we're going to be talking about is CIA funding. And yeah, it's not as simple as the CIA funded Al Qaeda. And to truly get into this, we're going to have to talk about money, weapons, and drugs. Now, CIA's covert operations like this particularly started in Southeast Asia, in regions like Laos, that all became central to the broader US strategy of preventing the spread of communism. Because, well, the spread of communism at the time was closely linked to the expansion of Soviet geopolitical influence, and US policymakers believed that if communism gained ground, particularly in strategically significant regions like Southeast Asia, it could provide the Soviet Union with new allies and thereby strengthen its global position. This was all associated with the domino theory, which held that if one country fell to communism, neighboring countries would follow suit, thereby compromising the security of US allies. The CIA would work with various local militia groups, some of which were dependent on significant profits generated from opium production, and in exchange for supporting these anti-communist guerrillas, the CIA turned a blind eye to the opium trade, which helped fund militias like the Hmong and other groups within the region. And this situation created a ironic paradox, as while the US sought to defeat communism through clandestine operations, the very local forces it supported funded their activities through involvement in lucrative drug trade. And these relationships would contribute to the region's long-standing role as a major center for global opium production and later heroin trafficking. And over time, these covert activities would help transform the area into what would later be known as the Golden Triangle, a major global hub for opium and heroin production and trafficking. During the 60s and early 70s, during the Vietnam and Laotian civil wars, allegations would emerge that the CIA, as part of a broader anti-communist strategy, was complicit in facilitating opium trafficking in Southeast Asia, as the agency is alleged to have provided logistical support, most notably through the use of Air America, a covert airline that was said to have transported opium from remote poppy-growing regions in northern Laos to support its allied forces, including Hmong groups led by General Vang Pao. Around the same time, Frank Lucas would emerge as a major figure in the US heroin trade, establishing a direct and expansive network that funneled high-purity heroin from overseas sources into American urban centers, and his operations capitalized on systemic neglect by law enforcement and socioeconomic vulnerabilities of inner-city neighborhoods. Historian Alfred W. McCoy contends that when the Laotian Air Force was unable to operate, Air America became the only available option for landing on makeshift runways near mountaintop poppy fields, thereby inadvertently moving opium, which was later refined into heroin. Former CIA paramilitary operatives, including Anthony Pochepny, also known as Tony Poe, and ex-Air America pilots have supported these claims, alleging that the airline profited from, or at least turned a blind eye to, the drug trade. Beginning in 1979, during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the United States, under the umbrella of Cold War geopolitics, sought to counter Soviet expansion, and the CIA would spearhead Operation Cyclone, which was a covert program designed to support Afghan Mujahideen fighters. The program would funnel billions of dollars into various anti-Soviet groups, primarily through intermediaries such as Pakistan's Inter Services Intelligence, or ISI, and their intent was to weaken Soviet influence by bolstering local resistance. Afghanistan, part of the region, later known as the Golden Crescent, was already a significant opium producer at the time, and because of this, allegations would emerge that the CIA turned a blind eye or indirectly facilitated opium trafficking by certain Mujahideen forces, whose drug profits helped fund their insurgency. And following Soviet withdrawal in 1989, Afghanistan would become the leading heroin supplier. However, during the United States invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, in retaliation for the September 11th terrorist attacks, the Golden Crescent's opium production would take a huge hit, producing almost 90% less opium than in 2000. However, only after a few years, the Golden Crescent would reach its peak of opium production in 2007, producing more than 8,000 of the world's almost 9,000 total tons of opium. Those who were not enemies of the United States or were covertly doing this in Afghanistan ran a near monopoly on opium production. You know what else would peak around this time? The United States opioid crisis. Now, backtracking from the 2000s to 1980s, let's talk about the Iran-Contra affair. And just to show you that everything I've talked about is not an isolated incident, this was when the United States conducted secret arms deals to fund Contra rebels in Nicaragua with connections to drug trafficking. So during the 1980s, the Iran-Contra affair would emerge as a major covert operation in which the Reagan administration secretly facilitated arms deals to fund Contra rebels in Nicaragua who were engaged in a struggle against the Sandinista government. It would surface that the CIA was involved in drug trafficking operations at Mena Intermountain Municipal Airport in Arkansas, as these operations were reportedly linked to funding these Contra rebels in Nicaragua. And beyond Nicaragua, the US was also entangled in Iran through secret dealings, as throughout the 1980s, elements within the Reagan administration facilitated weapons sales to Iran, despite it being officially designated as a state sponsor of terrorism. These deals were justified as a part of broader strategy to secure the release of American hostages held by Iranian-backed groups in Lebanon, and were part of a clandestine diplomatic effort to gain influence in the region while simultaneously funding the Contras. One of the most controversial aspects of this was the group Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed militant group in Lebanon. While the Reagan administration publicly condemned Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, the arms shipments to Iran, Hezbollah's primary benefactor, created a contradiction within U.S. policy. Concurrently, the United States would also experience a severe crack cocaine epidemic, which researchers and investigative journalists have linked to these covert operations. Most notably, Gary Webb would write the Dark Alliance series, alleging that the CIA and its anti-communist efforts turned a blind eye and facilitated the flow of cocaine into urban areas, thereby contributing to the crack epidemic and the resulting surge in gang violence and the eventual war on drugs.
Today I ask for your support and the support of our people in this effort to fight the drug menace, to eradicate the cancers of organized crime and public corruption
that disproportionately affected minority communities, particularly African American and Latino populations. After writing this book, Gary Webb would be found dead in his home. He was shot twice in the head, and his death was ruled as a suicide. And yeah, you pretty much get the picture. It was all one big circle. Now, to address the original statement of CIA funding Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda would formally be established by Osama bin Laden in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Figures like Osama bin Laden, who had been involved in the broader jihad against the Soviets, began consolidating like-minded militants into what would become Al-Qaeda. So yes, in some ways, the CIA did inadvertently create this group. Now, by no means do I want you to think, oh man, yeah, the CIA, they created Al-Qaeda so that they would commit the September 11th attacks and thereby the US would be able to invade Afghanistan. No. That's too far. That's way too far. Come, reel it in. Right? It's really as simple as the CIA trying to prevent the spread of communism created an even bigger enemy for itself without knowing what they were doing at the time. Yeah. All right, now we can move on to the next one. All right, next what we're talking about pan-Islamism, and pan-Islamism is the ideological foundation that underpins many Islamist movements, including Al-Qaeda, and it advocates for the political and spiritual unity of all Muslims under a single Islamic governance system, often envisioned as a restored caliphate. For groups like Al-Qaeda, pan-Islamism is not merely a cultural or religious sentiment, but a call to action, justifying jihad as a means to overthrow secular or Western-aligned regimes and establishing a global Islamic order governed by Sharia law. All right, next we're talking about MAK, and MAK, or Maktab al-Khidmat, or the Office of Services, was a key organization that was founded in the early 1980s by Abdullah Azzam and Osama bin Laden to recruit, fund, and facilitate foreign fighters, primarily Arab volunteers, who wanted to join the Afghan Mujahideen against the Soviet Union. Established in Peshawar, Pakistan, with backing from various Islamic charities and wealthy Gulf donors, MAK functioned as a logistical hub, coordinating travel, training, and resources for jihadists arriving from the Middle East. And though it operated under the broader goal of supporting Afghanistan's anti-Soviet resistance, they were more than just a service organization, as it became a breeding ground for militant ideology, uniting radicalized fighters who would later go on to form or influence Al-Qaeda. The USS Cole bombing was a suicide attack that was carried out by Al-Qaeda on October 12, 2000, in the Yemeni port of Aden, targeting the U.S. Navy destroyer USS Cole while it was refueling. Two attackers in a small boat with explosives approached the side of the ship and detonated their payload, creating a massive blast that tore a 40 by 60 foot hole in the vessel's hull, killing 17 American sailors and injuring 39 others. This attack was orchestrated by Jamal al-Badawi and planned by Abdul Rahim al-Nashiri, who were both key al-Qaeda operatives under the directive of Osama bin Laden. And this would mark one of al-Qaeda's most significant pre-9/11 operations, showcasing its capability to strike U.S. military assets. Yet, at the time, it did not provoke immediate large-scale military retaliation. And this, in turn, emboldened al-Qaeda, reinforcing its belief that attacks could be carried out with limited U.S. response. The Egyptian Islamic Jihad, or EIJ, was a militant Islamist organization founded in the late 1970s, with the goal of overthrowing the Egyptian government and replacing it with an Islamic state governed by Sharia law. Rooted in radical ideology, it emerged as a violent offshoot of the broader Egyptian Islamist movement, particularly influenced by the writings of Sayyid Qutb, which promoted jihad against secular regimes. The group will become infamous for high-profile attacks, including the 1981 assassination of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, who was targeted for signing the Camp David Accords with Israel. And basically, the Camp David Accords were a peace agreement brokered by U.S. President Jimmy Carter between Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, leading to Egypt becoming the first Arab country to recognize Israel in exchange for the return of the Sinai Peninsula. These accords laid the groundwork for the 1979 Egypt-Israel peace treaty, but failed to resolve the Palestinian issue, which led to, of course, continued regional tensions. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the EIJ would carry out numerous bombings and assassination attempts against Egyptian officials and foreign interests, while its members also faced intense crackdowns by the Egyptian government. And in the 1990s, under the leadership of Ayman al-Zawahiri, they would shift their focus from domestic targets to a broader global jihad, forging ties with Osama bin Laden and merging with Al-Qaeda in 1998. This merger would play a crucial role in Al-Qaeda's evolution into a transnational terrorist network, as the EIJ brought with it experienced militants, ideological justification for targeting Western powers, and extensive underground networks. And its leaders, particularly al-Zawahiri, were instrumental in planning the September 11th, 2001 attacks. Jamal Ahmed al-Fadl was a Sudanese militant and former associate of Osama bin Laden in the early 1990s, who joined al-Qaeda in 1988. However, he would become an informant to the United States government on al-Qaeda's activities and was pivotal in providing the U.S. government legal and intelligence efforts against al-Qaeda. His testimony given in federal court during the 1998 embassy bombings trial provided some of the first detailed insights into al-Qaeda's organizational structure, their financial dealings, and their ties with Sudan's government while bin Laden was based there in the early 1990s. And his testimony would become crucial in legally defining al-Qaeda as a global terrorist organization. The Caucasus Emirate was an Islamist organization that emerged in the North Caucasus region of Russia in 2007 following the collapse of the Chechen separatist movement. Founded by Daka Umarov, a former Chechen rebel leader, the group declared itself an independent Islamic state and sought to establish Sharia law across the region. Again, they were an evolution of earlier Chechen resistance movements, which initially fought for independence from Russia, but gradually adopted jihadist ideology, aligning themselves with global Salafi jihadism rather than secular nationalism. And the group would carry out numerous terrorist attacks, including suicide bombings and mass killings, targeting both Russian security forces and civilians, such as the 2010 Moscow metro bombings and the 2011 Domodedovo airport attack. And though it operated independently, the Caucasus Emirate maintained ideological and operational ties with al-Qaeda, as many of its leaders pledged allegiance to al-Qaeda's global jihadist movement. The bin Laden-King Fahd connection was the complex and ultimately hostile relationship between Osama bin Laden and King Fahd of Saudi Arabia. And this was all shaped by bin Laden's early ties to the Saudi royal family. Bin Laden, coming from a wealthy and influential Saudi family with close business ties to the monarchy, was a celebrated figure in the fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan. However, their relationship would sour in 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait, prompting Saudi Arabia to allow U.S. military forces onto its soil, which was a decision that bin Laden opposed, seeing it as a betrayal of Islamic principles and an affront to the sovereignty of the Muslim world. He directly appealed to King Fahd, offering to use his own Mujahideen fighters to defend the kingdom, but was dismissed, and this rejection, coupled with the Saudi government's deepening ties to the US, would radicalize bin Laden even further, leading to his expulsion from Saudi Arabia in 1991 and his eventual exile to Sudan. The 1998 U.S. Embassy bombings in East Africa were a coordinated attack carried out by al-Qaeda on August 7, 1998, targeting American diplomatic missions in Nairobi, Kenya, and Tanzania. The attacks involved massive truck bombs that detonated outside the embassies, killing 224 people, including 12 Americans, and injuring over 4,500. These bombings were one of al-Qaeda's first major international terrorist operations, demonstrating its capability to strike U.S. interests overseas, and the attack was symbolically timed to mark the 8th anniversary of the arrival of American troops in Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War, which was one of the grievances that Osama bin Laden cited against the U.S. These bombings were, of course, carried out by al-Qaeda operatives, many of whom had ties to Sudan and Afghanistan, where they had trained in jihadist camps. And this attack would prompt a swift U.S. response, including cruise missile strikes on suspected al-Qaeda facilities in Sudan and Afghanistan, also known as Operation Infinite Reach. But it also signaled the growing threat posed by al-Qaeda, setting the stage for later attacks in the years. Nick Berg was an American contractor who was abducted and brutally executed by al-Qaeda in May of 2004 in one of the most infamous beheading videos of the early 2000s. Berg, a 26-year-old telecommunications engineer, had traveled to Iraq independently, seeking to work on radio towers following the U.S. invasion, but he was detained by Iraqi police for 2 weeks before being released, after which he disappeared. A few weeks later, a video surfaced titled Abu Musab al-Zarqawi Slaughters an American, showing Berg in an orange jumpsuit before being beheaded by masked militants. The graphic footage was released online and was intended as both propaganda and retaliation for the Abu Ghraib prison abuse scandal, which had just been exposed, and Berg's murder would mark a turning point in jihadist media strategy, demonstrating how al-Qaeda and its affiliates would use shock tactics and online distribution to instill fear, recruit followers, and challenge Western influence within the region. The HTS al-Qaeda split was the 2016 to 2017 schism between Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, and al-Qaeda, which marked a major ideological and strategic division within jihadist movements in Syria. Originally, HTS evolved from Jabhat al-Nusra, which was al-Qaeda's official affiliate in Syria, and they pledged allegiance to al-Qaeda's leadership under Ayman al-Zawahiri. However, as the Syrian civil war progressed, HTS sought greater autonomy, focusing on local Syrian governance and military objectives rather than al-Qaeda's broader global jihadist agenda. This eventual divergence would lead to tensions, with al-Qaeda accusing HTS of deviating from core ideological principles, while HTS in turn viewed direct ties to al-Qaeda as a liability. The split culminated in HTS publicly severing ties, rebranding itself, and clashing with al-Qaeda loyalist factions like Haras al-Din, resulting in intra-jihadist power struggles within Syria. Al-Shabaab is a Somalia-based jihadist militant group that serves as al-Qaeda's official affiliate in East Africa. Emerging in the mid-2000s from the Islamic Courts Union, or ICU, which once controlled parts of Somalia, Al-Shabaab has since evolved into a formidable insurgent force. It seeks to establish a strict Islamic state under Sharia law and has waged a violent campaign against the Somali government, African Union forces, and Western interests within the region. The group has carried out numerous high-profile terrorist attacks, including the 2013 Westgate Mall attack in Kenya, which killed at least 67 people, and the 2015 Garissa University massacre, where 148 people were murdered. Al-Shabaab funds its operations through extortion, taxation, piracy, and illicit trade, and it has very deep ties with Al-Qaeda, with whom they pledged allegiance to in 2012. And while primarily focused on Somalia and Kenya, its influence and terror operations extend throughout the Horn of Africa, making it one of the most dangerous jihadist organizations in the region. The Letter to the American People was a document that was written by Osama bin Laden in 2002, following the September 11th attacks, in which he outlined Al Qaeda's justifications for targeting the United States. The letter, which was published online and later translated into English, accused the U.S. government of oppression, particularly citing its support for Israel against Palestinians, its military presence in the Middle East, especially in Saudi Arabia, and its involvement in conflicts like the Gulf War and sanctions against Iraq. Bin Laden framed the attacks as a form of retaliation for what he perceived as U.S. aggression, arguing that American citizens were responsible for their government's actions because they paid taxes and participated within the democratic system that enabled these policies. The letter also condemned Western social values, including democracy, secularism, and cultural liberalism, positioning Al Qaeda's ideology as fundamentally opposed to the US led global order. The Afghan Soviet War, as we talked about from 1979 to 1989, was a brutal Cold War conflict in which the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up the communist government against a growing insurgency. The invasion faced fierce resistance from the Mujahideen, which was the coalition of Afghan guerrilla fighters who waged a jihad against Soviet forces. Like we talked about, they were backed by extensive covert aid from the United States via Operation Cyclone, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and other allies as the Mujahideen received weapons, training, and funding to counter Soviet occupation. Foreign fighters, including Osama bin Laden, traveled to Afghanistan to join the resistance, forging networks that later evolved into Al Qaeda, and after a decade of bloody conflict, the Soviets would withdraw in 1989, leaving behind a devastated country. And the war not only contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union, but also created a power vacuum in Afghanistan, leading to civil war, the rise of the Taliban, and the eventual emergence of Al Qaeda as a global jihadist force. The 2015 Charlie Hebdo attack was a terrorist assault carried out by two gunmen, Saeed and Sharif Kouachi, on January 7, 2015 at the Paris offices of Charlie Hebdo, a French satirical magazine known for publishing controversial cartoons, including depictions of the Prophet Muhammad. The attackers, who were later identified as operatives claiming allegiance to Al Qaeda, stormed the building with assault rifles, killing 12 people, including the magazine's editor, cartoonists, and police officers. And this attack was seen as retaliation for Charlie Hebdo's perceived blasphemy against Islam. And it would be revealed that the Kouachi brothers had ties to extremist networks, as Sharif had previously been convicted for attempting to join jihadist fighters in Iraq, and Saeed had reportedly trained with Al Qaeda in Yemen. The attack, followed by a related hostage crisis at a kosher supermarket carried out by their associate Ahmadi Koulibaly, who pledged allegiance to ISIS, triggered global debates on freedom of speech, Islamic extremism, and security policies, while also reinforcing concerns over the radicalization of Western-born jihadists. Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin, or JNIM, is a militant jihadist group operating primarily in the Sahel region of Africa, particularly in Mali. It was formed in March of 2017 as an official Al-Qaeda affiliate, resulting from the merger of several regional jihadist groups. Led by Iyad al-Ghali, JNIM follows the broader Al-Qaeda ideology, advocating for the establishment of an Islamic state governed by Sharia law while opposing Western influence in local governments it deems illegitimate. They're known for their insurgent attacks, kidnappings, and ambushes against military forces, peacekeepers, and civilians, often targeting French and UN forces operating within the region. And unlike ISIS-affiliated groups in Africa, they remain loyal to Al-Qaeda's central leadership, emphasizing a more pragmatic, locally embedded insurgency strategy rather than extreme brutality. And they exploit regional grievances such as ethnic tensions, government corruption, and military abuses to expand their influence, and they still have a presence within West Africa today. The Al Qaeda Taliban alliance is a strategic and ideological partnership that dates back to the mid 1990s and was solidified when Osama bin Laden relocated to Afghanistan in 1996 after being expelled from Sudan. The Taliban, led by Mullah Muhammad Omar, provided Al Qaeda with sanctuary in exchange for financial support, military expertise, and assistance in fighting Northern Alliance forces during Afghanistan's civil war. Bin Laden, in turn, pledged loyalty to Omar, thereby deepening their relationship as Al Qaeda used Taliban controlled territory to establish training camps and plan attacks, including the 1998 US Embassy bombings and 9/11 attacks. Despite Taliban's claims of ignorance regarding 9/11 planning, their refusal to extradite bin Laden to the US led to the 2001 US invasion of Afghanistan, which toppled the Taliban regime at the time. However, remnants of both groups continued collaborating during the subsequent insurgency, with Al Qaeda providing fighters and ideological reinforcement to Taliban operations against US and NATO forces. The split between Al Qaeda and ISIS, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, was rooted in ideological, strategic, and leadership disputes that intensified between 2013 and 2014. Originally, ISIS began as Al Qaeda in Iraq, or AQI, and was founded by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in the early 2000s. However, Zarqawi's extreme brutality, particularly against fellow Muslims, clashed with Al Qaeda's leadership approach, which sought to avoid alienating potential supporters. And after Zarqawi's death, AQI would evolve into the Islamic State of Iraq, and later in 2013, its new leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, unilaterally expanded into Syria as the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, or ISIS. This move disregarded orders from al-Qaeda's leader at the time, Ayman al-Zawahiri, and when ISIS refused to comply, al-Qaeda officially disavowed ISIS in 2014, marking a permanent rift, and the schism led to violent conflicts between the two groups, particularly in Syria and beyond, as they vied for dominance within the global jihadist movement. Jamaat al-Tawhid wal-Jihad, or JTJ, was a militant jihadist organization founded by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in the late 1990s, initially operating in Jordan before shifting its focus to Iraq. The group adhered to a Salafi jihadist ideology, advocating for violent jihad to establish an Islamic State governed by Sharia law, and they gained international notoriety during the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, where it became one of the most brutal insurgent factions, responsible for a series of high-profile suicide bombings, beheadings of foreign hostages, and attacks on Shia civilians, aiming to fuel sectarian conflict. Unlike al-Qaeda's more strategic long-term approach, JTJ emphasized extreme brutality and sectarian violence, which initially led to tensions within al-Qaeda's leadership. However, in 2004, under increasing pressure from US forces and seeking greater legitimacy, Zarqawi pledged allegiance to Osama bin Laden, officially rebranding the group as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or AQI. And as we talked about, this organization would later evolve into ISIS after Zarqawi's death in 2006. In the early 1990s, Sudan became a critical base for al-Qaeda as Osama bin Laden relocated there from Afghanistan in 1991. After being expelled from Saudi Arabia, like we talked about, due to his opposition to the US military presence in the Gulf, Sudan, under the Islamist government of Omar al-Bashir, provided a safe haven where bin Laden established businesses, training camps, and a network of financial and logistical support for jihadist operations. During this period, al-Qaeda expanded its influence by building ties with local militant groups and facilitating attacks, such as the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, which we'll elaborate more on later in this list. However, growing international pressure, particularly from the US, forced Sudan to expel him in 1996, leading bin Laden to relocate to Afghanistan, where al-Qaeda would fully evolve into a transnational terrorist organization. The 9/11 attacks, orchestrated by al-Qaeda on September 11th, 2001, were a series of coordinated terrorist attacks targeting major U.S. landmarks. 4 commercial airliners were hijacked by 19 al-Qaeda terrorists. 2 were flown into the north and south towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, causing both buildings to collapse. A 3rd plane would strike the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, while the 4th, United Airlines Flight 93, would crash into a field in Pennsylvania after passengers attempted to regain control of the aircraft from the hijackers. Nearly 3,000 people were killed, making it the deadliest terrorist attack in history. The attacks were a direct assault on U.S. symbols of economic, military, and political power. In response, the U.S. would launch the War on Terror, invading Afghanistan to dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban from power, which had provided the group with safe haven. 9/11 remains a defining moment in modern history, shaping U.S. foreign policy, security measures, and international relations for decades to come. Tora Bora is a rugged mountainous region in eastern Afghanistan near the Pakistan border, infamous for being the site of a critical U.S. military operation in December of 2001 aimed at capturing or killing Osama bin Laden. Intelligence indicated that bin Laden and a contingent of al-Qaeda fighters had retreated to the cave complexes of Tora Bora. The U.S. military, relying heavily on airstrikes and Afghan proxy forces, rather than deploying a significant number of American ground troops, engaged in intense combat against the entrenched al-Qaeda militants. However, due to strategic miscalculations and failure to secure key escape routes, bin Laden and many of his followers were able to evade capture, likely slipping into Pakistan. The Battle of Tora Bora has since been widely criticized as a missed opportunity to eliminate al-Qaeda's leader early in the War on Terror, with many experts arguing that a more aggressive deployment of U.S. Special Forces could have altered the course of this conflict. Jabhat al-Nusra, officially known as Jabhat al-Nusra li al-Sham, was a Syrian jihadist group that emerged in 2011 as an offshoot of al-Qaeda during the Syrian civil war. Founded by Abu Muhammad al-Julani, it was originally established as al-Qaeda's official branch in Syria, receiving support from al-Qaeda in Iraq, or AQI, the precursor to ISIS. However, tensions would arise when AQI's leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, sought to merge Nusra with AQI to form ISIS, and this was rejected by both Nusra and al-Qaeda's leadership. Nusra would remain aligned with al-Qaeda until 2016, when it rebranded as Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, and then later again evolved into Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, distancing itself from al-Qaeda in an attempt to gain broader legitimacy among Syrian rebel factions. The Saddam al-Qaeda conspiracy is the widely debated and ultimately debunked claim that Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein had direct ties to al-Qaeda and was involved in planning or supporting terrorist activities, including the 9/11 attacks. This theory gained traction in the lead up to the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq, when the Bush administration suggested that Saddam's regime had supported Osama bin Laden's network, framing Iraq as a potential hub for terrorism. However, multiple investigations, including the 9/11 Commission report and intelligence reviews, found no credible evidence of operational collaboration between Saddam and al-Qaeda. In fact, their ideological differences made such an alliance highly unlikely, as Saddam's regime was secular, while al-Qaeda was a radical Islamist movement that viewed secular Arab leaders as enemies. All right, moving on to tier 2. And Qatar has long faced allegations of providing financial support to al-Qaeda affiliated groups, though the extent and nature of the support has remained debated. While Qatari government officially condemns terrorism and has cooperated with Western counterterrorism efforts, reports suggest that individual Qatari nationals, charitable organizations, and even elements within the government have facilitated funding to extremist groups, including al-Qaeda. And while Qatari authorities have taken steps to curb illicit financing under international pressure, it's argued that enforcement has been inconsistent, and the country's leniency towards extremist ideologies have contributed to the broader financing network that sustains al-Qaeda and its offshoots. The Turkestan Islamic Party, or TIP, formerly known as the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, or ETIM, is a militant jihadist organization that primarily seeks the establishment of an independent Islamic state in Xinjiang, China, which it refers to as East Turkestan. The group is composed mainly of Uyghur Muslims and has historical ties to al-Qaeda, sharing ideological and logistical connections within the broader global jihadist network. TIP first gained international attention in the 1990s when it launched attacks against Chinese targets, but it later expanded its operations beyond Xinjiang Xinjiang, particularly in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Syria, where it is fought alongside al-Qaeda affiliated groups such as Jabhat al-Nusra, benefiting from al-Qaeda's support structure while maintaining its primary focus on China. And they have been accused by China and international intelligence agencies of carrying out numerous attacks, including bombings and assassinations, while Beijing has in turn used its existence to justify mass surveillance, repressive policies, and internments against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. And despite it being a relatively small militant faction, its affiliation with al-Qaeda has ensured its survival, allowing it to operate within jihadist safe havens and sustain its insurgency against China. The 7/7 bombings were the July 7th, 2005 terrorist attacks in London, where four suicide bombers detonated explosives on the city's public transportation system, killing 52 civilians and injuring over 700 others. The attackers, Mohammed Sadiq Khan, Shahzad Tanweer, Hasib Hussain, and Jermaine Lindsay, were all British citizens with ties to radical Islamic networks. They carried out coordinated attacks on 3 underground trains and a double-decker bus, marking the deadliest terrorist attack in Britain since World War II, and al-Qaeda's influence was evident as Khan, the ringleader, had trained in Pakistan and appeared in a martyrdom video praising Osama bin Laden. However, it remains debated whether al-Qaeda directly planned the attack or if the bombers acted as self-radicalized sympathizers, and a failed follow-up attack on July 21st, 2005 using similar methods would reinforce fears of continued jihadist threats within the UK. The Salafist Group for Preaching in Combat, or GSPC, was an Algerian militant organization founded in 1998 as a splinter faction of the Armed Islamic Group, or GIA, and they would emerge during Algeria's civil war, rejecting the GIA's brutal tactics against civilians but maintaining a commitment to overthrowing the Algerian government and establishing an Islamic state. It adhered to Salafi jihadism, a strict interpretation of Islam that promotes violent jihad as a means to achieve religious and political objectives, and throughout the early 2000s, the GSPC expanded its operations beyond Algeria, engaging in attacks against government forces and forming connections with transnational jihadist networks. By 2006, under the leadership of Abdelmalek Jokdel, the group formally pledged allegiance to al-Qaeda, rebranding itself as al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and this affiliation will mark its evolution from a domestic insurgency into a key player in global jihad, engaging in terrorist activities across North Africa and the Sahel, including kidnappings, bombings, and attacks against Western interests. The Ikhwani connection is al-Qaeda's ideological and historical ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, or Ikhwan al-Muslimin, a transnational Islamist organization founded in Egypt in 1928. While al-Qaeda and the Brotherhood are distinct entities with differing strategies, their connection lies in the influence of Sayyid Qutb, a radical Brotherhood thinker whose writings, particularly Milestones, would lay the foundation for modern jihadist ideology. Sayyid's advocacy for takfir, or declaring other Muslim apostates, and violent jihad against secular regimes heavily influenced al-Qaeda's core doctrine. Many early al-Qaeda leaders, including Ayman al-Zawahiri, came from Brotherhood-affiliated circles in Egypt before becoming radicalized further. However, the Brotherhood traditionally pursued political Islam through gradual reform and state participation, whereas al-Qaeda rejects political engagement and calls for direct armed struggle. The 1993 World Trade Center bombing was the first major terrorist attack on the Twin Towers, orchestrated by a cell of Islamist extremists with ideological ties to al-Qaeda. On February 26, 1993, a massive 1,200-pound urea nitrate hydrogen gas bomb was detonated in an underground parking garage beneath the North Tower, killing 6 people and injuring over 1,000. The attack was led by Ramzi Youssef, who was a Pakistani militant trained in Afghanistan and backed by a network that included Kuwaiti-born Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, whose radical sermons inspired jihadists in the US and abroad. The bomb was meant to collapse the North Tower into the South Tower, but the structure withstood the blast, and the FBI quickly traced the attack to Youssef and his co-conspirators, leading to multiple arrests and convictions. And while al-Qaeda was not formally responsible, Osama bin Laden's network indirectly influenced and funded some of the individuals involved, marking one of the earliest terror plots in America linked to the jihadist movement that would later culminate in the 9/11 attacks. Telegram was a crucial platform for al-Qaeda and its affiliates due to its encryption and lenient content moderation policies, compared to mainstream social media, as unlike Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, which aggressively remove terrorist-related content, Telegram has historically been more resistant to outside pressure, which has in turn allowed jihadist networks to thrive in private and public channels. And Al-Qaeda and its media branches have used Telegram to disseminate propaganda, recruit sympathizers, and coordinate activities without fear of immediate removal. Al-Qaeda's presence in Tajikistan has been tied to the broader spread of Soviet jihadist movements in Central Asia, particularly after the aftermath of the Soviet-Afghan War and the Tajikistani Civil War from 1992 to 1997, as during this war, Islamist factions opposed the government and some militants had ties to foreign jihadist networks, including Al-Qaeda, and in the years that followed, Al-Qaeda operatives sought to use Tajikistan as a transit hub due to its borders with Afghanistan and Pakistan, where the group maintained strongholds. The Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, or IMU, which had ties to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, was particularly active in the region as they used Tajikistan for recruitment, training, and logistical support, and some Al-Qaeda-linked fighters even crossed into Tajikistan to escape counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan. Tajik nationals have been recruited into Al-Qaeda-affiliated groups in Syria, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, further linking the country to the organization. Al-Qaeda's first official branch in Yemen emerged in 1998 under the leadership of Abu Ali al-Harithi, who was a veteran jihadist that had fought in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. Yemen's borders and weak central government and tribal allegiances made it a strategic location for Al-Qaeda to establish itself, and the group's first major attack was the 1998 kidnapping of 16 Western tourists, which ended in bloodshed when Yemeni forces attempted a rescue. This was followed by the 2000 USS Cole bombing in Aden, and 2 years later, the CIA would kill al-Harithi in a 2002 drone strike, but Al-Qaeda in Yemen would continue to evolve, eventually merging with its Saudi counterpart in 2009 to form Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or AQAP, which became one of the group's most dangerous and influential branches. As-Sahab Media is Al-Qaeda's official media production and propaganda arm, responsible for disseminating the group's messages, recruitment materials, and ideological content. Established in the early 2000s, As-Sahab played a crucial role in shaping Al-Qaeda's global narrative using videos, audio message, and online publications to reach sympathizers and potential recruits. The media wing had released numerous high-quality productions featuring prominent Al-Qaeda leaders including Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, delivering speeches, ideological justifications, and strategic directives. During the 1980s and 1990s, Al-Qaeda's Afghan training camps would play a crucial role in transforming the organization into a structured global jihadist network. Originally, these camps were part of a broader network used by the Afghan Mujahideen during the Soviet-Afghan War, with many fighters receiving training funded and facilitated through the Pakistani intelligence, or ISI, with indirect support from the CIA. After Soviet withdrawal, Osama bin Laden and other jihadist leaders would repurpose these camps to train militants for a global insurgency, rather than just local conflicts. These camps will become the backbone of Al-Qaeda's operational structure, producing fighters involved in attacks such as the 1998 U.S. Embassy bombings and 9/11. And the Taliban provided sanctuary for these camps in exchange for Al-Qaeda's financial and logistical support, allowing them to operate largely unchallenged until the U.S. invasion in 2001. 3/11 was the 2004 Madrid train bombings, a terrorist attack carried out by Al-Qaeda-affiliated extremists on March 11, 2004. A series of 10 coordinated bomb blasts occurred during morning rush hour on Madrid's commuter train system, killing 193 people and injuring over 2,000. The attack, which targeted 4 packed trains, was initially blamed on the Basque separatist group ETA, but evidence soon pointed to Islamic extremists inspired by Al-Qaeda, specifically a Moroccan-led cell radicalized by the US-led invasion of Iraq. Haras al-Din, or HAD, is a jihadist group that emerged in Syria in 2018 as an Al-Qaeda affiliate, following ideological shifts within the Syrian jihadist landscape. The group was founded by hardline commanders who opposed the more pragmatic approach of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, which had distanced itself from Al-Qaeda and focused on local Syrian governance rather than global jihad. In turn, Haras al-Din would pledge allegiance to Ayman al-Zawahiri, Al-Qaeda's leader at the time, and position itself as a loyalist faction, advocating for strict adherence to Al-Qaeda's transnational jihadist vision. They would conduct attacks against Syrian government forces, rival jihadist factions, and occasionally Western targets, and despite its loyalty to Al-Qaeda, They struggled to gain dominance as they were fighting against HTS and had US drone strikes targeting its leadership and internal fragmentation, and over time they would become severely weakened, but they would remain an important chapter in Al Qaeda's post ISIS presence in Syria. The 2002 Bali bombings were a coordinated terrorist attack carried out by Jemaah Islamiyah, or JI, which was an extremist group linked to Al Qaeda. On October 12, 2002, in the tourist district of Bali, Indonesia, the attack involved 3 explosions. A bomber detonated a device inside Paddy's pub, followed by a larger car bomb outside the Sari Club, and a third, smaller explosion near the US consulate in Denpasar. These attacks would kill 202 people, including 88 Australians, 38 Indonesians, and 23 Britons, injuring over 200 others. And investigations revealed that the bombings were orchestrated by JI leaders with indirect operational and financial assistance from Al Qaeda. Harkat ul Mujahideen, or HUM, is a Pakistan based jihadist militant organization that has historical ties to Al Qaeda. Originally formed as Harkat ul Ansar, or HUA, in 1993 through the merger of 2 radical groups, Harkat ul Jihad al Islami and Harkat ul Mujahideen, the organization initially fought against Soviet forces in Afghanistan, but later shifted its focus to Kashmir, engaging in terrorist activities against Indian forces. After being designated as a terrorist organization by the United States in 1997, Harkat ul Ansar would then rebrand back into Harkat ul Mujahideen to evade restrictions, yet it continued operating with similar leadership and objectives. And they have historically maintained deep ties with Al Qaeda and the Taliban, as many of its members trained in Afghan terrorist camps under Osama bin Laden's network, and some even participated in Al Qaeda led global jihadist operations. In the immediate aftermath of the September 11th, 2001 attacks, Osama bin Laden publicly denied involvement, stating in a September 16th interview with Al Jazeera, quote, "I stress that I have not carried out this act," and this denial was widely interpreted as an attempt to avoid US retaliation, as he was already a wanted figure due to his role in previous attacks. However, as time passed, his stance changed, and by late 2004, in a videotaped message, he openly admitted responsibility for orchestrating the attacks, stating that he personally directed the operatives. And the contradiction between his initial denial and later admissions has fueled various conspiracy theories, with some claiming his early statement was genuine and others arguing that it was just a strategic deception. The Al Qaeda Iran alliance is a complex and somewhat paradoxical relationship, as Al Qaeda is a Sunni jihadist organization with deep seated hostility towards Shia Islam, while Iran is a Shia majority theocratic state. However, despite this sectarian divide, pragmatism has led to instances of tactical cooperation and mutual toleration between the two, as Iran has at times provided Al Qaeda operatives with safe passage, particularly after the US invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, when numerous senior Al Qaeda figures would flee to Iran to escape American retaliation. Inspire was an English language online magazine published by Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or AQAP, and was first released in July of 2010. Designed as a propaganda and recruitment tool targeting Western audiences, particularly young radicals in the US and Europe, the magazine provided ideological justifications for jihad and practical guides on carrying out terrorist attacks. It was notorious for its open source jihad section, which included DIY instructions for homemade explosives, most infamously an article titled, "How to Make a Bomb in the Kitchen of Your Mom." The topic of Al Qaeda and CIA double agents, I'm guessing, refers to the infiltration of intelligence agencies into jihadist networks and vice versa, as one of the most infamous cases was that of Humam Khalil al Balawi, who was a Jordanian doctor and jihadist sympathizer who would be recruited as a CIA informant in 2009. The CIA and Jordanian intelligence believed that he had successfully turned and could provide critical intelligence on Al Qaeda's operations in Afghanistan and Pakistan. However, he was in reality a double agent loyal to Al Qaeda and the Pakistani Taliban. On December 30th, 2009, he would carry out a bombing at Forward Operating Base Chapman in Khost, Afghanistan, killing 7 CIA officers and 1 Jordanian intelligence officer, marking one of the deadliest attacks on US intelligence personnel. And this incident would highlight the high-risk nature of human intelligence operations and al-Qaeda's ability to manipulate counterterrorism efforts and the intelligence failures that allowed a supposed informant to infiltrate a CIA base. During the Bosnian War from 1992 to 1995, al Qaeda operatives and other foreign jihadists became involved in the conflict, supporting Bosnian Muslim forces against Serbian and Croatian militias. The war, which erupted after the breakup of Yugoslavia, was marked by ethnic and religious violence, and Bosnia's Muslim population was seen by global jihadist networks as victims of genocide. Al Qaeda, along with other militant Islamist groups, would send fighters known as Mujahideen to Bosnia under the banner of humanitarian aid and military support, and many of these foreign fighters would join the El Mujahid unit, which was an elite force within the Bosnian Army's Third Corps, notorious for its brutality against enemy forces. Al Qaeda would also use the war as an opportunity to recruit, train, and establish logistical footholds in Europe, embedding operatives within Bosnia's post-war institutions, some of whom would go on to play later roles in global terrorist operations, including the 9/11 attacks. During the lead up to the 1991 Gulf War, Osama bin Laden and a network of his former Mujahideen fighters offered to defend Saudi Arabia against Saddam Hussein's Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Bin Laden, who had gained prominence during the Soviet-Afghan War, viewed himself and his forces as the rightful defenders of the Islamic world and proposed that the Saudi government rely on his experienced jihadist fighters rather than allowing non-Muslim Western troops to be stationed on Saudi soil. However, the Saudi royal family rejected bin Laden's offer, instead choosing to host hundreds of thousands of US and coalition forces to expel Iraq from Kuwait, and this decision deeply angered bin Laden, who saw the presence of American troops, particularly in Islam's holiest of lands, as a betrayal and humiliation, which all became a turning point in his radicalization against the Saudi monarchy in the United States. The Khobar Towers bombing was a terrorist attack on June 25, 1996 that targeted a U.S. Air Force housing complex in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, killing 19 U.S. servicemen and injuring nearly 500 people. The explosion, caused by a massive truck bomb, was one of the deadliest attacks on American forces stationed in the Middle East, and the official U.S. investigation concluded that the attack was orchestrated by Saudi Hezbollah, a Shia militant group that was allegedly backed by Iran rather than al-Qaeda. However, Osama bin Laden later claimed influence over the attack, and some analysts speculate that al-Qaeda operatives may have even played a peripheral role in its planning. Londonistan is a term used to describe the period from the 1990s to mid-2000s when London would become a hub for Islamist radicalism, as Britain provided asylum and legal protections to various extremist clerics and militant figures. During this time, radical preachers such as Abu Hamza al-Masri, Omar Bakri Muhammad, and Anjem Choudary openly operated in the UK, using its liberal free speech laws to spread extremist ideology, recruit followers, and raise funds for jihadist causes. Many of these figures were linked to al-Qaeda affiliated networks and played a key role in fostering a generation of militants who would later participate in global terrorist operations, including the 7/7 London bombings in 2005. British authorities initially tolerated their activities under the assumption that these extremists would refrain from attacking their host country, focusing instead on overseas conflicts like the Bosnian War, Chechen resistance, and jihad in Afghanistan. However, this policy backfired as radical networks grew stronger within Britain, leading to security concerns and the eventual crackdown on extremist groups in the mid-2000s. Ansar al-Islam was an extremist jihadist group founded in 2001 in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, with the aim of establishing an Islamic state governed by strict Sharia law. The group was initially composed of Kurdish Islamists and foreign fighters, some of whom had ties to al-Qaeda, and it gained notoriety for imposing brutal rule in territories under its control, enforcing strict religious codes, and carrying out attacks against Kurdish secular forces and U.S. military targets. Before the 2003 U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, Ansar al-Islam maintained a stronghold in northern Iraq where it reportedly received support from al-Qaeda's operatives in Afghanistan, though exact level of coordination with Osama bin Laden's network remains debated. And following the US invasion, the group suffered heavy losses from airstrikes and Kurdish offensives, leading to its eventual fragmentation. However, many of its surviving members would later join al-Qaeda in Iraq, which evolved into the Islamic State, or ISIS. The Islamic Emirate of Yemen was a short lived militant proto state declared by Al Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula, or AQAP, in 2011 during the political turmoil of Arab Spring and Yemen's civil unrest. As the Yemeni government struggled to maintain control, AQAP would take advantage of this, and amidst the power vacuum, they seized significant territory, including the cities of Zinjibar, Jar, and Shukra, and they declared an emirate. The group's control, however, was tenuous, as by mid 2012, the Yemeni military, backed by US drone strikes and local militias, launched a counteroffensive that drove AQAP out of their strongholds, and the entire emirate would collapse. All right, moving on to tier 3. And first, we're going to talk about the 2004 Australian Embassy. And the 2004 Australian Embassy bombing was a car bombing that took place on September 9th, 2004 in Jakarta, Indonesia, targeting the Australian embassy. The attack was carried out by Jamaah Islamiyah, or JI, a Southeast Asian terrorist organization with links to Al-Qaeda, and the explosion, caused by a van packed with explosives, killed 9 people, including the bomber, and injured over 150. The bombing was seen as retaliation for Australia's strong support of the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, with Al-Qaeda and its affiliates condemning Australia's military involvement in the Middle East. Paul Marshall Johnson Jr. was an American engineer working in Saudi Arabia when he was kidnapped and brutally murdered by Al-Qaeda in June of 2004. Johnson, an aviation contractor for Lockheed Martin, specialized in Apache helicopter maintenance, which was a detail that made him a high-value target for militants who opposed U.S. military involvement in the Middle East. His abduction would be carried out by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or AQAP, who demanded the release of Al-Qaeda prisoners in exchange for Johnson's life. The militants would go on to release a chilling video of Johnson in captivity, blindfolded and pleading for his life, and despite efforts by US and Saudi authorities to locate him, he would be beheaded on June 18th, 2004, and the execution would be filmed and disseminated as part of Al-Qaeda's psychological warfare tactics and propaganda. Shortly after, Saudi security forces would launch a crackdown, killing Abdulaziz al-Mukrin, the leader of AQAP, and other operatives. This would underscore the rising threat of Al-Qaeda's regional branch and its strategy of targeting Western civilians, as there were so many people that would be kidnapped at this time. The Middle East was a dangerous place to be. The global call of Islamic resistance is a concept promoted by radical Islamist ideologies, particularly Abu Musab al-Suri, a key al-Qaeda strategist, and advocates for a decentralized global jihadist movement where individuals and small autonomous cells take up violent resistance against Western powers and regimes perceived as apostates. This strategy, detailed in al-Suri's Call to Global Islamic Resistance in 2004, emphasizes leaderless jihad, encouraging lone wolf attacks and grassroots militancy to make the movement more resilient against counterterrorism efforts. Jamaah Islamiyah, or JI, is a Southeast Asian jihadist organization with direct ties to Al-Qaeda, operating primarily in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. It was founded in the 90s by radical clerics Abu Bakar Bashir and Abdullah Sunkar, and they aimed to establish an Islamic caliphate across Southeast Asia, and they would gain notoriety for their involvement in the 2002 Bali bombings, and would be heavily influenced by Al-Qaeda's global jihadist ideology, receiving financial and logistical support from Osama bin Laden's network. And while they initially focused on attacking Western targets and government institutions, the group would weaken significantly over time. Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis, or ABM, is a Salafi jihadist militant group based in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, originally formed in 2011 following the political upheaval of the Arab Spring. The group, whose name translates to Supporters of Jerusalem, initially focused on attacking Israel, launching rocket strikes and cross-border raids. However, after the military ousting of Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi in 2013, ABM would shift its focus towards targeting the Egyptian security forces, carrying out deadly bombings and assassinations against police and military personnel. In 2014, the group would pledge allegiance to ISIS, becoming one of the most lethal branches of the Islamic State outside of Iraq and Syria, and they would escalate their insurgency against the Egyptian state, including the downing of Metrojet Flight 9268 in 2015, which killed 224 people on board. Next, we're going to talk about Al Qaeda Hamas ties. And while Al Qaeda and Hamas are both designated terrorist organizations by the United States and other governments, their ideological foundations and operational focus have been pretty distinct, with limited direct cooperation, as Al Qaeda promotes a global jihad aimed at establishing a transnational Islamic caliphate, primarily targets Western nations and their allies, and Hamas, on the other hand, is a Palestinian nationalist Islamist movement that has claimed that they seek the destruction of Israel and the establishment of an Islamic State in historical Palestine. While Al Qaeda has criticized Hamas for engaging in electoral politics and for prioritizing nationalist struggle over global jihad, there have been some instances of rhetorical and ideological overlap, as Al Qaeda leaders, including Ayman al Zawahiri, have occasionally praised Hamas's armed resistance against Israel, while also urging the group to adopt a more transnational jihadist approach. The Atun Adnani Mubahala is a rare and significant moment of ideological and theological warfare between two major jihadist factions, Al Qaeda and the Islamic State. The term Mubahala refers to an Islamic practice of invoking a divine curse upon the party that is lying in a dispute, effectively calling upon God to judge between the two conflicting sides. This specific Mubahala was issued in 2015 by Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, ISIS's chief spokesperson, against al-Qaeda's leadership. Adnani accused al-Qaeda of deviating from true jihadist principles by compromising with local groups and failing to establish a proper Islamic State. And this would mark a deep and irreparable ideological schism between the two groups, effectively solidifying their rivalry and fueling continued hostilities. Al Qaeda has historically exploited charity organizations both as a funding mechanism and cover for logistical operations, as many Islamic charities, some with legitimate humanitarian missions, would be infiltrated or manipulated by Al Qaeda to channel donations towards financing their terrorist activities, arms purchases, or recruitment efforts. KitabOnline.com is an online platform known as the Comprehensive Islamic Library. It offers a vast collection of Islamic literature and scholarly works, and it provides access to thousands of free books across various subjects, including theology, history, and more, aiming to serve as a resource for individuals seeking knowledge about Islam. And while the platform itself is not affiliated with extremist organizations, it's important to note that some users may access such libraries to study religious texts, which can be interpreted in various ways depending on the reader's perspective. And I mean, that's all religions, right? Specifically for this website, it has served as a repository of Islamic knowledge. And although its contents are neutral, it could provide a certain sense of radicalism. Kataib Abdullah Azzam is a militant jihadist group named after Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian cleric often considered the ideological father of global jihad and the mentor of Osama bin Laden. Established in 2009, the group is a Sunni militant organization affiliated with Al-Qaeda, primarily operating in Lebanon, Syria, and the broader Middle East, and it emerged as a transnational jihadist force committed to targeting Western interests, Shia populations, and Lebanese security forces, as well as conducting attacks against Hezbollah due to their support for the Assad regime in the Syrian civil war. The group would be responsible for several high-profile bombings, including the 2013 attack on the Iranian embassy in Beirut and multiple rocket strikes against Israel. And they would more specifically focus on attacking Hezbollah and Iran's regional influence, aligning with broader sectarian conflicts rather than the transnational movement. The idea of a Al-Qaeda Houthi alliance is largely a misinterpretation of the complex and contradictory relationships between these militant groups in the Middle East and Africa, and more specifically Yemen, as we've talked about. So before we move on, I just want to discuss and point out that most educational institutions, specifically when I came up learning through high school, these specific terrorist organizations, those that were of Islamist descent, they all had the same ideology. That's what I was taught. They were just all Muslim. That was it. You never really get into the differences in beliefs or things like that. So yeah, that's what I just want to emphasize, that though there are many groups with the same religion, they may have different doctrines and beliefs and whatnot. So Al Qaeda and the Houthi movement are bitter enemies, and they've been engaged in conflict for years. The Houthis, a Shia Zaidi movement backed by Iran, have been fighting the Yemeni government and the Saudi led coalition, while Al Qaeda, a Sunni extremist group, considers the Houthis heretical and has conducted numerous attacks against them. There's no really cooperation between them that I could find. Al Qaeda in Iraqi Kurdistan is the presence and operations of Al Qaeda linked jihadist groups in the autonomous Kurdish region of northern Iraq, particularly in the early 2000s. And the most notable of these groups was Ansar al Islam, a militant organization formed in 2001 from the merger of Kurdish Islamist factions. And they would establish a stronghold in northeastern Iraq near the Iranian border, implementing strict Sharia law in areas under its control and launching attacks against secular Kurdish forces. The group would have ideological and logistical ties to Al Qaeda, receiving training and funding from networks linked to Osama bin Laden. And after the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, American and Kurdish forces would launch a military campaign that significantly weakened this group, leading to the remnants of the group later merging with Al Qaeda in Iraq, or AQI, the precursor to ISIS. Ansar Ghazwatul Hind was an Islamist militant group that emerged in 2017 as an Al Qaeda affiliate operating in the Kashmir region. Founded by Zakir Musa, a former commander of Hizbul Mujahideen who split from the group due to ideological differences, AGH would position itself as the official wing of Al Qaeda in India, aiming to establish an Islamic caliphate in the region rather than solely focusing on Kashmiri separatism. However, they would face significant resistance from Indian security forces, and Musa would be killed in 2019, dealing a severe blow to its operational capabilities, and by 2020, the group would be largely dismantled following counterterrorism operation. Voice of Jihad was Al Qaeda's official media publication, and it was designed to spread propaganda, ideological justifications, and strategic messages to both its followers and the broader Muslim world. It served as a digital magazine and multimedia platform, often published in Arabic, with the primary aim of promoting jihadist narratives, glorifying attacks against the West, and recruiting new members. Chirpwire is an alternative social media platform that was said to have been co-opted by extremist groups, including Al-Qaeda affiliates, in order to disseminate propaganda and coordinate activities. Notably, Al-Shabaab Shahada News Agency utilizes Chirpwire to report attacks and share content without the risk of moderation or removal, as the platform lacks content oversight and is not very strict. The kidnapping economy is Al Qaeda's systematic use of kidnapping. And we kind of hit on this over the years. Al Qaeda and its affiliates would use hostage taking as a lucrative business model, generating millions of dollars annually. And they would kidnap Westerners, including journalists, aid workers, and diplomats. And the kidnapping economy not only served as a financial tool, but also as a propaganda tactic, as a lot of these people were killed and it was recorded. So people were watching these hostages be killed or beheaded. And it was, yeah. Management of Savagery is a jihadist strategic manifesto written in 2004 by Abu Bakr Naji, and the text serves as a guide for militant groups, including Al Qaeda, outlining how to exploit chaos and state collapse to establish an Islamic caliphate. There are claims that the Gulf Cooperation Council, or GCC, member states or individuals within these countries funded Al Qaeda. And while no GCC government has officially endorsed Al Qaeda, numerous reports and investigations suggest that wealthy individuals, charities, and religious organizations in countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Kuwait provided financial support to jihadist groups during the 1980s and 1990s, often under the guise of aiding Islamic resistance movements. After 9/11, leaked U.S. diplomatic cables and intelligence reports suggested that private donors in the Gulf continued financing Al Qaeda-linked groups, with U.S. officials referring to Saudi Arabia as the most significant source of funding to Sunni terrorist groups worldwide. All right, moving on to tier 4. Yeah. Ooh. The Al Qaeda Madkhali alliance was an alleged and controversial relationship between certain factions of Al Qaeda and followers of Rabbi al Madkhali, a Saudi Salafi scholar known for his strong pro government stance in opposition to jihadist groups. Reports suggest that individual Madkhali followers cooperated with jihadists, particularly in Libya, accused of indirectly facilitating or turning a blind eye to Al Qaeda affiliated groups when their objectives align. "Your citizenship is under my feet" is a phrase attributed to Anwar al-Awlaki, a radical Yemeni American cleric who became a key figure in al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or AQAP. The phrase was reportedly spoken in response to US government's efforts to revoke his citizenship due to his involvement in terrorist activities, and his role in al-Qaeda made him one of the most influential jihadist figures in the early 21st century, leading to his eventual targeted killing by a US drone strike in Yemen in 2011. There are claims that Ayman al-Zawahiri orchestrated the assassination of Abdullah Azzam. However, this is a widely debated theory. Abdullah Azzam, often considered the father of global jihad, was a Palestinian Islamist scholar and the mentor to Osama bin Laden, as we talked about, and played a key role in mobilizing foreign fighters during the Soviet-Afghan War. Azzam advocated for a broader jihad movement focused on defending Muslim lands, but he also opposed targeting fellow Muslim governments. In contrast, Ayman al-Zawahiri was more radical, prioritizing the overthrowing of secular Muslim regimes and pushing for a global jihadist movement. By the late 1980s, tensions would grow between Azzam and Zawahiri over the future of the jihadist movement, particularly as Zawahiri sought to merge the EIJ with bin Laden's emerging Al Qaeda, promoting a more aggressive strategy. On November 24th, 1989, Azzam would be killed in a car bomb explosion in Peshawar, Pakistan, alongside his two sons. And while no one claimed responsibility, many suspect that Zawahiri and his faction within the Mujahideen orchestrated the hit to remove Azzam as an ideological rival and consolidate al-Qaeda under bin Laden's leadership. Others believe the assassination could have been the work of Pakistani intelligence or the ISI, Mossad, the CIA, or even Soviet operatives, as they all had their own interests in destabilizing militant networks. And regardless, his death would mark a turning point, as al-Qaeda would go on to embrace Zawahiri's vision of targeting both Muslim governments and Western powers. WorldofIslam.net was a now defunct pro-jihadist website that served as an early online hub for extremist propaganda, recruitment, and ideological dissemination. Pankisi Gorge, a remote valley in northeastern Georgia, would become a critical hotspot for Islamist militancy in the early 2000s. Originally home to the Kists, a Muslim ethnic group related to Chechens, the area saw an influx of Chechen refugees and foreign jihadists during the Second Chechen War from 1999 to 2009. As Russia intensified its crackdown on Chechen separatists, militants, and those affiliated with al-Qaeda, US and Russian intelligence would view the area as a major terrorist sanctuary, prompting Georgia, under pressure from Washington, to launch counterterrorism operations in the early 2000s, aided by US military advisors. The FSB agents theory is based on claims and speculation that Russian intelligence, particularly the Federal Security Service, or FSB, the successor to KGB, and some theories suggest that Russian intelligence had foreknowledge of al-Qaeda activities or even infiltrated jihadist networks in order to manipulate global terrorism for strategic gains. And most notably, Alexander Litvinenko, a former FSB officer who defected to the West, alleged that the FSB had covertly supported terrorist activities to justify crackdowns and consolidate power within Russia, similar to like Operation Northwoods, you know what I mean? And additionally, there have been claims that certain Chechen jihadists with ties to al-Qaeda had previous FSB connections, though all this evidence remains circumstantial. The 6 Easy Steps for Defeating al-Qaeda was a September 10th, 2007 video release by Abu Yahya al-Libi, in which he offered the United States several unsolicited tips for better prosecuting its war of ideas against al-Qaeda. And his decision to volunteer strategic advice to the United States was more a satirical situation, kind of. However, it played on the rigid bureaucratic structure within Al Qaeda and the flaws in their operations. As the Six Steps humorously pointed out, that Al Qaeda was prone to self destruction due to its incompetence, fighting with other faction groups, and alienation of local populations, and highlighted how the group's extreme violence often backfired, leading to loss of support. The relationship between Al Qaeda and Hezbollah, as we talked about, is complex, and it's been marked by both ideological opposition and sometimes pragmatic cooperation. Al Qaeda, a Sunni jihadist organization, and Hezbollah, a Shia militant group backed by Iran, are historically adversarial due to their sectarian differences. Hezbollah aligns with Iran's vision of Shia expansionism, while Al Qaeda has often targeted Shia Muslims, viewing them as heretics, leading to them, fighting. The 2000 Kuala Lumpur summit was a pivotal meeting of Al Qaeda operatives held between January 5th to January 8th of 2000 in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. The summit brought together high-ranking militants, including Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, two future 9/11 hijackers. The purpose of this gathering was to discuss upcoming terrorist attacks. Malaysian intelligence, at the request of the CIA, conducted surveillance but did not record audio or take further action, and the participants dispersed after the meeting. And the failure to track the attendees, particularly Midhar and Hazmi, who later entered the US despite being on watch lists, became one of the most significant missed opportunities to prevent the 9/11 attacks. The failed assassination of Hosni Mubarak occurred on June 26, 1995 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, when Al-Qaeda operatives working alongside Egyptian Islamic Jihad, or EIJ, attempted to kill the Egyptian president. Mubarak, who had been a staunch opponent of Islamist extremism, had cracked down on militant groups in Egypt and was visiting Ethiopia for an African Union summit when gunmen ambushed him near the airport. They opened fire on his convoy, but his armored vehicle shielded him from harm, and investigations later revealed that the attack had been orchestrated by Al-Qaeda-linked operatives. The claim that Bashar al-Assad's regime funded Al-Qaeda stems from evidence suggesting that during the Iraq War from 2003 to 2011 and the Syrian civil war, the Syrian government supposedly allowed and in some cases facilitated the movement of jihadists linked to Al-Qaeda. Saif al-Adul in Somalia is the suspected presence and activities of Saif al-Adul, a high-ranking Al-Qaeda leader and former Egyptian Special Forces officer in Somalia during key periods of jihadist expansion in East Africa. He played a crucial role in Al-Qaeda's global operations, and although primarily based in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and later Iran, his connections were vital in establishing Al-Qaeda's footprint in the Horn of Africa, aiding in the training of Somali jihadists and facilitating their access to resources and operational knowledge. The phenomenon of Al-Qaeda soldiers on Twitter is the use of, social media, particularly Twitter, by individuals associated with or sympathetic to Al-Qaeda to promote their ideology and recruit followers and spread propaganda-like videos. I don't really know what this is specifically alluding to, but I'm sure there were Al-Qaeda operatives on Twitter just like sharing stuff. But yeah. At Murakebe was a prominent account and online persona associated with pro-Al-Qaeda content and on social media, particularly on Twitter. Yeah, there we go. Taisir Aluni, a prominent Al Jazeera journalist, became a central figure in the controversial relationship between Al Jazeera and Al Qaeda in the early 2000s. Aluni gained international attention when he interviewed Osama bin Laden in 2001, shortly before the September 11th attacks, and subsequently reported extensively on Al-Qaeda's activities. His close association with Al-Qaeda would become a focal point for critics who argued that Al Jazeera, a leading Arabic language news outlet, played a role in providing a platform for extremist views. And in 2003, Aluni would be arrested by Spanish authorities on charges of aiding and abetting Al-Qaeda. In 2005, he would be convicted of supporting terrorism, as supporters argued that Aluni was simply performing his journalistic duties. Like, if you're a journalist and it's your job to, get the story and you have the opportunity to interview a leader of a terrorist organization like Osama bin Laden, do you take it? It's a complex situation. All right, moving on to tier 5. Abu Abdul Rahman al Maghrebi is a prominent figure linked to Al Qaeda who became notably active in Afghanistan post 2021 following the Taliban's takeover of the country. Al Maghrebi, a senior member of Al Qaeda, is believed to have been involved in the group's operations and strategic planning during the chaotic period after the US and NATO forces withdrew from Afghanistan. After the Taliban's return to power in August of 2021, he was believed to have been living together with Zawahiri in the same house in downtown Kabul, where Zawahiri would later be killed in a US drone strike. However, as of today, his official whereabouts are unknown. The biography of the Distinguished Martyrs is a propaganda piece produced by Al Qaeda that aims to glorify and idealize the lives and deaths of its operatives who have died in pursuit of jihad. And the document serves as both a tribute and a recruitment tool, portraying these individuals as martyrs who have sacrificed their lives for the cause of Islam and the global jihad against perceived enemies, particularly the United States and its allies. The message to those who have left arms is a propaganda piece produced by Al Qaeda aimed at dissuading fighters from abandoning their cause and choosing peace over continuing their jihadist activities. And the document targets individuals, framing their decision as a betrayal of the cause and the larger Islamic struggle against the West, perceived enemies of Islam. The Al Qaeda triad ties, I think, is about the relationships between Al Qaeda and organized crime groups like the triad, specifically, maybe specifically alluding to the connections between Al Qaeda and triad gangs in Asia or drug cartels and smuggling rings, as they could have been potentially significant in the 90s and early 2000s. Yeah, they could have exploited connections with larger criminal organizations to facilitate their expansion. The claim that Pakistan tipped off bin Laden is a controversial and debated topic. However, some theories suggest that elements within the Pakistani government or military may have had prior knowledge of bin Laden's whereabouts, where he was ultimately found by US Navy SEALs. And additionally, some intelligence reports and leaked documents indicate that there may have been indirect cooperation or willful blindness from certain Pakistani officials who had long been involved in supporting insurgents in Afghanistan. However, there's no conclusive evidence that emerged that directly implicates the Pakistani government in tipping off bin Laden about certain raids. It's all really just theoretical. Defunct jihadi forums are just online forums that spread radical Islamist ideologies, and they're now deleted. But as you can assume, during the early emergence of the internet, these were around. Yeah. Al Qaeda's presence in Sudan has evolved significantly over the years, especially after the 2019 overthrowing of al Bashir. And while they're no longer an operational base for Al Qaeda, there are still factions within the country that maintain ties with various jihadist groups. The term overlapping martyrdom claims, I'm assuming, is in the context of Al Qaeda referring to when multiple individuals or groups claim responsibility for martyrdom of a particular attack or operation. It's really just speculation on whether certain attacks are actually done by Al Qaeda, or if they just see an attack and are like, oh, yeah, let's claim responsibility for that. Because, the whole fucking publicity thing. AlecAlas.net was a prominent online platform that played a role in the early 2000s in promoting Al Qaeda's ideology and spreading jihadist propaganda, including video footage of attacks and messages from key leaders, and was part of a larger effort by Al Qaeda to leverage the internet as a tool for recruiting new members and advancing their global jihad agenda. Dark websites. This is associated with Al Qaeda's online platforms and forums hidden within the deep web, typically only accessible through specialized software like Tor. Apparently, these sites are used by members and sympathizers to communicate, spread propaganda, and recruit new followers. I've never used dark web before, so maybe anyone that has can advocate towards this. I don't know. I don't know what kind of stuff is. Well, I know what kind of stuff is on. But yeah. The claim that Hamza bin Laden, the son of Osama bin Laden and prominent figure within Al Qaeda, is alive stems from the various rumors and unverified reports following his disappearance from the public eye in 2017. Hamza, who had been groomed by his father to become a leader within the organization, was believed to take a visible role in Al-Qaeda's media campaigns, making threatening statements against the West and calling for attacks. However, last known official communication from him occurred in 2017. Subsequent reports suggested that he had been in hiding, and in 2019, the US announced that it had killed Hamza in a counterterrorism operation in Afghanistan or Pakistan. Those specifics of the operation and his death remained unclear for some time, and despite this, some Al-Qaeda supporters and conspiracy theorists argue that Hamza may have survived and is either in hiding or playing a covert role within the group's leadership. The Battle of Mogadishu, commonly referred to as Black Hawk Down, took place in Somalia on October 3rd, 1993, during a U.S. military operation aimed at capturing warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid. U.S. forces, part of a larger United Nations mission, attempted to raid a building in Mogadishu where Aidid's top lieutenants were meeting, and the mission went awry when 2 U.S. Black Hawk helicopters were shot down by Somali militia forces, leading to intense urban combat. U.S. forces were trapped in the city, facing heavy resistance from militia fighters, and the operation resulted in the deaths of 18 American soldiers, with over 100 wounded and significant Somali casualties. And while the battle had little direct connection to Al-Qaeda at the time, it helped shape the radicalization of several future jihadist leaders, including Osama bin Laden, who saw the event as a symbol of U.S. vulnerability and the power of asymmetric warfare. All right, moving on to tier 6. First thing we're going to talk about is al-Nusra wasn't in the Al-Qaeda branch in Syria. So in 2012, as the Syrian war intensified, al-Nusra Front would emerge as a significant jihadist group in Syria, initially claiming allegiance to Al-Qaeda and its leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri. Tensions eventually rose between Al-Qaeda's leadership and al-Nusra's autonomy, and this culminated in Al-Qaeda formally distancing itself from al-Nusra in 2016, marking the group's transformation into Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. Yeah, so I think this is, I don't know if we covered that right, but it's, I don't know. In the early 2000s, Musab al-Suri, a prominent jihadi ideologue and strategist, utilized websites to propagate his ideas and mobilize supporters. And his notable contribution was the publication of his manifesto, the Global Islamic Resistance Call, which he distributed online. And yeah. The next topic we're talking about is Zawahiri intentionally led Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, defect. And as we just talked about, in 2016, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda, is believed to actually intentionally allow HTS, formerly known as Jabhat al-Nusra, to break away from Al-Qaeda. There's a theory that by not intervening to prevent the split, Zawahiri allowed HTS to assert its autonomy in Syria, signaling Al-Qaeda's flexible approach to regional dynamics. It's all purely theoretical. During the early stages of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, there were rumors and reports suggesting that Al-Qaeda may have sent fighters to Ukraine to join the conflict against Russian forces, allegedly under the guise of Chechen Ichkeria, a self-declared independent Chechen government that has historically opposed Russian rule. The Chechen separatists, many of whom were involved in jihadist groups or have global ties to militant networks. Some analysts speculate that Al-Qaeda may have been leveraging this situation to gain or extend influence in this theater of conflict. However, as of now, there's no definitive confirmation that Al-Qaeda itself orchestrated or formally supported these volunteers. GeoNews and Rocket Chat are both associated with the use of communication platforms by extremist groups, including Al-Qaeda, for organizing and spreading propaganda. Yeah, I don't know. Israel did Charlie Hebdo. Now, this is the claim that the Charlie Hebdo attack in January 7th, 2015 was orchestrated by Mossad and is part of a broader conspiracy theory that alleges the attack was a false flag operation intended to defame Islamists and promote anti-Muslim sentiment. This is all theoretical, though. It's a theory. In the late 1990s, as Al-Qaeda's influence in the international community's concerns about Osama bin Laden's actions grew, Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban, reportedly considered giving up bin Laden to the United States and other nations. This decision came after mounting pressure following the 1998 US embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania. He was hesitant and reluctant, but he did acknowledge that bin Laden's actions were jeopardizing the Taliban's legitimacy. He ultimately decided against handing over bin Laden, but there are claims that he tried to hand over bin Laden and the US rejected this. It's all really, it gets into some really theoretical stuff, but yeah. Some radical followers of Osama bin Laden have propagated the belief that he was a figure akin to the Mahdi, a messianic figure in Islamic theology who is expected to appear before the day of judgment and restore justice and righteousness. This interpretation stems from bin Laden's portrayal of himself as a leader chosen to wage a global jihad against the West, which he and his followers considered to be the embodiment of evil and corruption. And for many of his radical supporters, bin Laden's actions and rhetoric position him as the Mahdi's spiritual predecessor, or even as the Mahdi himself. There's a theory that Al Qaeda's orchestration of the September 11th attacks was, in part, a strategic move designed to provoke the US and its allies into military action against the Taliban, as it's claimed that Al Qaeda believed that by inflicting mass casualties and provoking the US, they could spark a broader regional conflict, destabilize the Afghan government, and inspire more radical movements within Muslim majority countries. This one's another theory, but it's an interesting one. All right, moving on to tier 7, Egyptians. Al Qaeda, despite being most closely associated with Osama bin Laden, a Saudi Arabian, this group was predominantly founded and led by Egyptians. In fact, 2/3 of the original founders of the organization were Egyptian nationals, with figures like Ayman al Zawahiri, who would later become Al Qaeda's second in command, and eventually its leader after bin Laden's death. Yeah, it's just an interesting fact. There's a claim that Stephen Paddock, the perpetrator of the 2017 Las Vegas shooting, had ties to Al Qaeda or ISIS, and this just stems from a series of rumors, misinformation that circulated after the attack, as ISIS took responsibility for the incident, claiming that Paddock had converted to Islam, and this claim was not substantiated. Yeah, but interesting stuff. Abu Musab al-Suri had connections to Algerian jihadists that stem from his close involvement with several groups in the 1990s, notably the Armed Islamic Group, or GIA, a violent Algerian faction fighting the Algerian government in the context of the Algerian Civil War. And his concept of individual jihad found resonance with the Algerian militants, whose brutal tactics during the Civil War included mass killings and bombings, and mirrored his vision of coordinated, decentralized attacks against perceived enemies of Islam. Another interesting fact. There's a rumor that Al Qaeda fighters used the classic arcade game Bubble Bobble as a form of training. And this is an unfounded claim, but the narrative gained traction in the early 2000s when numerous sensational stories surfaced about Al Qaeda supposedly using this game to train members to develop coordination skills and improve their ability to work in tandem. But there's no solid evidence to support this claim. Al Qaeda's leadership and operations were heavily documented through various forms of recordings and writings, many of which have been lost or remained unreleased for various reasons. As some key documents, such as letters and manifestos, I'm talking about like actual written shit on paper, were either captured by US military forces during raids or just straight up destroyed. And some of these documents were permanently deleted by intelligence agencies to prevent sensitive information from falling into public hands, or many just remain classified or only partially available. There's a rumor that Al Qaeda drew inspiration from Malcolm X. Malcolm X, as many of you know, was an influential figure in the civil rights movement, particularly known for his advocacy for Black empowerment and his early association with Nation of Islam and his later religious conversion to Sunni Islam. However, for some of the more radical rhetoric from his earlier speeches, particularly his calls for self-defense and resistance against oppression, it's claimed that Al Qaeda's ideological framework is somewhat based on Malcolm X's ideas, but there's no evidence to suggest that Al Qaeda pulled inspiration from Malcolm X. But I still put him in the thumbnail. Al Qaeda is not a real organization. There's a theory that Al Qaeda was created by the CIA or Mossad to defame Islam, positing that the terrorist organization is an entirely fabricated entity, either directly or indirectly engineered by Western intelligence agencies, like propaganda for Western civilization. Yeah, bonus tier. We have a bonus tier. I have a whole bunch of other shit that I'm going to talk about. Osama bin Laden was assassinated by the US Navy SEAL Team 6 during Operation Neptune Spear on May 2nd, 2011, in Pakistan. CIA had tracked bin Laden to a fortified compound, and the SEALs infiltrated this compound via stealth helicopters, engaging in a brief firefight before reaching bin Laden on the third floor, and he was shot twice, where his body was taken in for DNA confirmation, and within hours, his remains would be buried at sea to prevent the creation of a martyr's shrine. And does anyone remember Obama announcing that? I was 11 years old at the time, and everyone was celebrating, and it was a crazy time to be alive. That brings us to Robert O'Neill. Robert O'Neill is a former US Navy SEAL who claims to have fired the shots that killed Osama bin Laden during the 2011 raid on his compound. He's a veteran of SEAL Team 6 and participated in numerous high-profile missions, but he gained international recognition after publicly stating in 2014 that he was the one who delivered the fatal shots to bin Laden. Now, despite whether he did or not, this goes against the ethos and unwritten code of special forces operatives in talking about their missions or who killed who. That's just not something that they do. And his account has, of course, been met with some controversy, as other SEALs have offered conflicting narratives about who exactly killed bin Laden. And since leaving the military, O'Neill has become an interesting guy. He was arrested in 2016 for a DUI and then arrested again in 2023 after assaulting a security guard. And he was like calling him an N-word or something like that. I don't know. In 2024, he was criticized online for a reply to a tweet. There were like 5 guys who voted for Kamala Harris or something like that. And the tweet said like, real men support Harris. And then O'Neill was like, you're not real men. You're boys. If there was no social media, you would be my concubines. I don't know if you guys know, but he's saying that. But yeah, just an interesting figure. The Osama bin Laden hard drive was a collection of digital files recovered from bin Laden's compound in Pakistan during the 2011 raid that killed him. And CIA declassified portions of the drive in 2017, revealing a mix of jihadist documents, personal letters, and unexpected pop culture material, as among the files were anime episodes like Naruto, Bleach, and Hollywood movies like Ants, Resident Evil, and pirated games like Final Fantasy VII, and even memes. And this provided insight into his, I guess, personal life, as he was a micromanager of global terror and renounced Western media despite consuming it while he was in hiding. So it's just ironic. In 2009, Al-Qaeda sent Nigerian extremist Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalab on a mission to blow up Northwest Airlines Flight 253 using a bomb hidden in his underwear. The bomb failed to detonate, and he was subdued by passengers and crew, and he would be forever known as the underwear bomber. But yeah, that's it. That's all we're going to talk about today. Again, I just come across this iceberg online and saw comments that said people wanted to cover it. So here we are. Maybe we'll do an ISIS iceberg or any other icebergs covering organizations. I actually enjoyed researching and learning things that I had no idea about, because this is not stuff that they teach you at school, of course. For sure, though, the next video is going to be about gangs. So stay tuned for that. Anyways, yeah, I hope you guys are doing well, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll catch you in the next one. I love you, bro.